guys, welcome back to my channel. I have a very fun video for you guys today. We are going to be ranking all of the eyeshadow palettes I tried out in the year 2023. I've got a list here of 27 palettes that I tried out this year. Technically, there were a few more that did not make it through a couple of declutters that I did this year. So these are all palettes that I actually like, even the ones ranked at the bottom. But of course, with all the makeup that I try, some I like a lot more than others. We're gonna get to it all today. I will rank all of these in order from least favorite to most favorite, and the top 10 I will also be swatching for you guys. I can't wait to share my list with you. You guys know how much I love talking about eyeshadow palettes, so it should be a lot of fun. Before we get into all the eyeshadow palettes, I want to give a special welcome to any of you that are new here. Thank you so much for joining me today. I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you do, make sure that you subscribe to my channel before you leave and make sure your notification bell is turned on. And with all of that said, let's get right to it. So I'm going to try and just breeze through, particularly the first, like the bottom half of this list. Starting with number 27, I'm going to go with the Alter Ego Mirage palette. This is meant to be a dupe for the Huda Beauty Empowered palette. Now I love Alter Ego. They are one of my favorite brands because they dupe some of my very favorite palettes. I do have the original Huda Beauty Empowered palette, which is one of the reasons why this is ranking at the bottom, because it's a dupe for a palette that I already own. I think it's a great dupe for that palette. I actually don't like that palette as much as a lot of people like it. It seems, I know that palette was really highly raved about this last year. Maybe it came out the year before. I like it, but there's some things I don't like about it. A couple of the cream shadows don't work super well for me. There are a couple shades I feel like are missing inside there. So if you've been interested in that palette, but it was a little out of your price range, I think this is a great option for that. This is just not one of my favorite palettes, even in its original form. All right, number 26. This one is kind of new. I feel like this one I'm not super familiar with. It might move up in the rankings, but I'm not so sure about that. It comes from ColourPop. It is the Heavy Petal palette. I tried this one out a few months ago. I did use it a few times. I think I used most of the shades in here. It's not the best ColourPop palette that I've ever tried. There are a few shades I thought were kind of fun and special, but it's just not a super inspiring color story. A couple of these peach shades I felt like were a tiny bit on the chalky side, which I've been noticing occasionally happens with ColourPop palettes for me lately. They'll have a shimmer formula that I just don't like very much. It doesn't have like good staying power to my lids, and I kind of felt that way about some of these shades in here. It's not bad, but it wasn't my favorite. It doesn't hold up to the standard of some of ColourPop's better shadow palettes. It's just not my favorite. For number 25, I'm gonna go with the Huda Beauty Matte Obsessions palette, the Warm Matte Obsessions. There is some repetition in this palette. It is super warm. I'm not opposed to warm shadows, but I have some warm palettes that we'll be talking about high up in the rankings. And this is just not my very favorite warm palette. It's mostly the repetition in here that kind of bothers me. I think the formulas are great. I actually love Huda Beauty's matte formula. It's really pigmented and easy to blend, but this is just not one I reach for super often. It obviously doesn't have any shimmers in here. I am not someone that can do an all matte look. Well, I could, but I don't. I like shimmer on my lid at all times. So I don't often use this on its own, and it's just not one that I'm so excited about that I would use this with something else to supplement with. Ranked at number 24, I'm gonna go with the LA Colors Radiant Beauty Palette. This is a $2 or $3 palette. I think it was around $2.48, $2.98. I picked it up at my local Walmart. The quality might be what you would expect from a palette that's under $3, but it's better than I thought it would be considering it was only $3. The mattes performed pretty well. They blended pretty well. You're definitely going to need a primer with this palette. It doesn't have the best staying power, but the shimmers were okay. The color story is really nice, and the mattes were not that bad. It actually created some really nice eye looks. So if you are on a very tight budget, this is a pretty good one. Ranked at 23, I'm gonna go with the Physicians Formula Butter Eyeshadow Palette in Sultry Nights. Now this one I feel like should rank higher. I actually really liked the formulas. It smells, oh, every time I open this, any of the butter palettes, they smell amazing. If you're familiar with the Physicians Formula butter scent, you'll love the smell of this. The formulas were really nice. I thought the shimmer formulas were nice. A good range of colors in here from light to dark and shimmer to matte. I just haven't used this a lot. I've used it enough to know that the quality is good, but it's kind of just been forgotten and put off to the side. It's possible that this could move up in the rankings. I don't know. I've got a lot of eyeshadow palettes. There's a lot of competition for this one. Quality is great. I feel like I should have liked it more, but compared to what's in front of it, I had to rank this a little lower. In the 22nd spot, I'm gonna go with the Sydney Grace Heaven on Earth palette. I wish I liked this palette a little bit better. One of the cutest packaging that they have ever done. You guys know Sydney Grace is like my all-time favorite eyeshadow formula brand. And this looks like a color story I would really love. I had a hard time getting some of these, like getting looks out of this palette alone. There's just something about the combination of these colors. They turned more green on my eyes and more colorful than they would appear just looking at it in the pan. I love the formulas, but just some of the colors surprised me how bold they were on my eyes. And when it comes to green eyeshadow, I like something very subdued, nothing overly bold and intense. And I feel like I got a lot of depth and intensity out of this palette, more so than I was expecting to get. So it's just a color story that didn't suit me very well in my very picky preferences when it comes to green eyeshadow. If you really love your greens and you don't mind a little bit of color, a little bit more blue, I think you'll love this one. Just wasn't one that I see myself reaching for a ton in the future, despite its amazing formula. Coming in at 21, I'm gonna go with the Lost in Los Angeles palette from BH Cosmetics. Now, obviously this one is very, very colorful. Probably not a palette that I'm gonna use on its own, but there are some fantastic lid shades in here. And when you wanna throw a pop of color into your crease, some really fun peaches, an amazing matte white, which I feel like a matte white should be in more eyeshadow palettes. It transforms what you can do with an eyeshadow palette when you have a matte white. However, this is just not a really good standalone palette, which is why it's ranking a little bit lower, but it is a really fun one and one I would definitely recommend if you are into colorful eyeshadows. For number 20, I'm gonna go with my Pat McGrath Labs mini eyeshadow palette in Sublime Smoke. I would like this one so much more if this shade right here was just slightly different. It's a little on the yellow side. I don't like the look of a yellow toned like champagne gold on my inner lid. Even though I like a warm champagne, there's this fine line where if something has too much yellow in it, I just don't think it looks very good on my skin tone for some reason. So I just wish this shade was not quite so yellow, and this would actually move way up in the rankings. I love the purple one that she did a couple years ago. Was it last year? Maybe the year before. I do love the Pat McGrath eyeshadow formulas. I think they're really nice, and I love the other shades inside here. Really good bronzes. The mattes are amazing. Just that one inner corner shade I just feel is a little bit off on my skin tone. Ranked at number 19, I'm gonna go with my Viseart San Francisco Etoile palette. I feel like this one should be ranked higher. The Viseart formula is really nice. I think it's partly the size of this palette that it gets overlooked. I mean, I'll put it on my desk in front of me and I just can't even see it. It's so tiny. I mean, this is such a tiny eyeshadow palette. These are the type of eyeshadows that kind of blend themselves, but the metallic formula is kind of a more sheer, weak, less intense formula, and you guys know that I like my metallics to be very, very punchy, and these ones are a little bit more on the subtle side, which I think is why this is just not a palette that I found myself reaching for very often. Good quality, but they're expensive for what you get, and I'm not sure that I'm as wild about this whole color story and about the shimmer formula enough for me to rank it a little bit higher. Moving along, coming in at number 18, I'm gonna go with the Essence Hello Berlin palette. I don't know if this one is available anymore. Some of these travel essence palettes have been discontinued. This one's actually really good. This is another formula, kind of like the LA Colors formula, that you're gonna need a primer with if you want these to last really well. I also feel similarly about these shimmers as I do about the Viseart shimmers. Not that they're the same quality, but just the reflectiveness. It's a little bit more of a subtle reflective metallic than something very bold and punchy and opaque. It's a little bit more basic, but I love the mattes in here. They're actually very pretty, and with the primer, these look a lot more expensive and fancy than they actually are. For number 17, I have a newer one. This is the ColourPop Nude Mood palette. This is another one I can see myself ranking a little bit higher as I use this a little bit more. I've only had this for about 4 weeks now, but I've used this thing a lot. I don't know if you guys can see how dirty this is. I've really been enjoying this palette. There are some beautiful, beautiful mattes and shimmers in here. I love all of the formulas, love the warm tones, and it's just a very well curated palette as far as light and dark mattes and light and dark shimmers. Gives you some really good complete eye looks, whether you want something a little more soft and neutral or something a little deep, rich, and smoky. It's really beautiful. I've been very impressed with this palette, and I foresee that this one might kind of move its way up the list. For number 16, I'm gonna go with the Huda Beauty Cool Matte Obsessions palette. I like this one a lot better than the Warm Matte one, partly because it's a little bit more of a unique color story. It's kind of berry tone, but more cool berry tones, which is not a color story I own a lot of. There's not as much repetition in this one, so each individual shade is very different from the shade next to it. I do love the Huda Matte formula. It is intensely pigmented, it blends like a dream. I mean, they're very high quality eyeshadows. I love the cream formula that you get in here. It gives this beautiful richness that I really love. Really nice formulas, fun color story. I do have to add a shimmer to this, but I don't mind doing it with this palette. Ranked at number 15, I'm gonna go with the Alter Ego Coastal palette. They sent this palette to me back in the spring, and it surprised me how much I enjoyed this palette. I think it's meant to be a dupe for the Huda Beauty, oh, I'll list it right here, I forget the name. of that palette. It's not one that I was ever really interested in, but this is a really fun color story, very different from most of the palettes that I typically buy or try. It's much more kind of soft and pastel, but cool tone pastels, which is not really usually my style, but I really have enjoyed playing with this last year. There's some really fun formulas and colors inside here. I don't know how it compares to the original, but I think this color story, if you like your cooler tone, kind of light pinks and purples and bluish tones, I think you would really love this. Ranked at number 14, I'm gonna go with the Pat McGrath Mothership Bijou Brilliance Face Palette, Face and Eye Palette. This palette I just got during the last Sephora sale. It was a $76 eyeshadow palette that only includes 9 shades. Really, it's the $76 price tag that makes me want to rank this a little bit on the low side. I do like the eyeshadows in here. I think they're really pretty colors. The formulas are really nice. I also love the Pat McGrath blushes, but for some reason, these 2 blushes right here, I don't like them as much as the other 2 blushes of hers that I have. I don't know why that is. I am wearing this one on the top on my cheek stick. It is very pretty. I don't dislike them. I kind of like her old holiday formatting. I feel like for the size and the weight of this palette and the price, you just don't get as much inside as I was hoping you would or maybe expecting. Ranked at number 13, I'm gonna go with the Sydney Grace Unbreakable Bond palette. You guys know how much I love Sydney Grace's eyeshadows. This is a beautiful color story. A lot of pink and peach in here. I mean, most, like this whole section here is very warm and kind of pink and like pinky peaches. And then you get a couple of cool tones down here, which I think is a really fun and different color story. Gives you a lot of variety in the type of eye looks you can create with this. The metallics, you guys know, Sydney Grace metallics will just never do you wrong. They are so good, and these ones are no exception. Beautiful palette, one that I've really enjoyed this year if you like your warmer, like kind of pinky peaches. Ranked at number 12, I'm gonna go with the Alter Ego Sakura palette. Now this one is meant to be a dupe for perhaps one of my, if not my all-time favorite Natasha Denona palette, the Retro Glam palette. Such a fun color story, and I think they did such a great job with this palette. I will link for you guys right here in case you're new or you missed it. The video where I compared this side by side to the original Natasha Denona one. I thought it performed so well. I've used it a handful of times even since first trying it out. And comparing it to my Natasha Denona, I think it's just about as good. I even think at times some of the shimmers in the Alter Ego formulas are even a little bit more punchy than what you get from Natasha Denona. Those ones can be a little bit more buildable, which I think can be a good thing or a bad thing depending on what you're looking for. I'm talking very subtle differences here, but seriously, the comparison is very impressive. So if you're looking to save a buck on that palette and want something similar, this is a great option. For number 11, I'm gonna go with the ColourPop Fresh Greens palette. I picked this up, I think, at Target back in the spring, and I was so impressed with this green palette. The color story, as I mentioned in the Sydney Grace palette, those green tones being a little bit off for what I like in the type of greens that I like to reach for, these are perfect. They're more kind of khaki or brown toned greens, which is what I like. A green that's not going to be too colorful or too bold on the eyes, maybe has a little bit more brown or silver in the shimmers, and this gives you some really beautiful options that are not over the top if you don't like color quite as much or you're not quite as bold. The shimmers in here are beautiful formulas. Sometimes ColourPop nails their shimmers, not always, but sometimes when they do, they do. They're so good when they really nail it. Like with these, they are just so pigmented and metallic and intense. Just look how pretty those like seafoam kind of silvery greens are. Oh my gosh, they're so pretty on the eyes. This is such a beautiful eyeshadow palette. Beautiful color story. The mattes are all really nice and rich and deep and pigmented. They blend well. I love the range from light to dark in here. Really great palette if you're into greens that aren't overly bold. Okay, we're down to my top 10. So these ones, I will insert some close-ups of these palettes and some swatches for you guys so you can have a closer look at them. Starting with number 10, I'm gonna go with a palette that's not even available technically anymore, and it's the Pat McGrath Celestial Nirvana palette. This was 2022's holiday release. I found it at a local Marshall's for like 40 bucks. And I am so glad I did, you guys. I have been using this thing so much lately. It has been sitting on my desk for the last 2 months and I have been reaching for it over and over again. There are a couple shades in here that are way too bold for me. I'm specifically talking about these 3 shades right here, but everything else in here is so beautiful, so fun. I love the color range. This is the type, not even this color story, But this setup is what I wish she would have just done again, because I love both of these palettes so much. The red one from 2 years ago, and then this one from last year. It feels like a much better value to me to get this many shades of Pat McGrath eyeshadows in one palette, and she does some really fun formulas and color stories. This is just such a fun one. I've been really enjoying it. Ranked at number 9, I'm gonna go with the Sydney Grace Raspberry Kiss palette. This one, I think, was a bundle that they had years ago, and then they put it in a palette this year with their summertime sale release. You guys, this is so good. If you like your berry tones, like very pinky kind of raspberry tones, this is the perfect palette. The range from light to dark and shimmer to matte gives you the most complete, beautiful eye looks, whether you're doing something a little bit softer, more feminine and natural, or something kind of rich and dark and smoky. This is just so good. Pinks and berry tones, in my opinion, look good on anyone. They're the type of colors that if you are someone that just does like neutral browns and you're kind of afraid to venture out of your basic neutrals category, but you kind of want to, I would start with pinks or berry tones, because I feel like they're natural, more natural looking on the eyes than you would think looking at a color story like this. They look very feminine and soft and pretty. I feel like they would look good on a lot of different skin tones, whether you have a warmer undertone or a cooler undertone. I just love pinks and berry tones. I think they look so good, and this is a perfectly curated berry tone palette. Ranked at number 8, we're gonna go with the BH Cosmetics Amore in Amalfi palette. This is so good, you guys. I love the BH Cosmetics eyeshadow palettes. Now, if you own the old Chicago eyeshadow palette, which I think has been, it has been discontinued. I actually decluttered mine a couple of years ago. That palette was from like 4 or 5 years ago. This is almost, it reminds me an awful lot of that palette. I don't have that one to compare anymore, but I remember that palette having a lot of kind of pink and orange and golden brown tones in it. You kind of get a similar thing in this palette, but you guys, if you like your warm toned neutrals, this is fantastic. So many good colors and formulas, good variety in here, great lid shimmers. That's one of the things I love so much about BH Cosmetics eyeshadows are their lid shimmers. They're such good formulas. They're so sparkly and beautiful and pigmented. They brighten up your eyes, but they're not too chunky or textured looking on the eyelids. I just love them. I think BH Cosmetics does some of the best eyeshadow palettes, and this one is no exception. It's amazing. Okay, number 7. This palette has been around for years. In fact, I don't think you can buy this anymore, but I just picked mine up again at a Marshall's, and you guys, I don't know why I slept on this palette, because it is so incredibly good. I'm sure the reason I did is because the color scared me. I'm talking about the ABH Norvina palette, the volume 4. Now, the pinks in here, when all these palettes released, each of them had a pretty bold color story that just felt like a little bit too much for me, a little bit too in your face for what I typically reach for in an eyeshadow palette. But if you take out some of these brighter purples and pinks and even that yellow right here, there's a lot of wearable in here that maybe you overlook when you first see those colors. Now, I know a lot of this doesn't matter anymore, because if you don't have this palette already, I don't think that you can get it anymore. But man, you guys, these are fantastic. The formulas in here are so good. The lid shimmers, you get a good variety of lid shimmers. They're all really good formulas. You get a good variety of mattes in here as well, and more neutrals than I initially thought looking at this. It is such a fun one. I've used this thing a lot this last year, and I wish I would have used it back when I could tell you guys to run out and grab it yourselves. I don't know, maybe you're grateful that you can't buy it anymore. One less palette you have to be tempted to buy. Coming at number 6 is the ColourPop Petals on Point palette. This palette is such a beautiful color story that is very unique to my collection. I do not own a lot of shades like this within my collection. It kind of reminds me of the vibe I get from the Coastal palette from Alter Ego that I was talking about back at, where did I rank that one? Yeah, I ranked that one at number 15, but this one's even more different. It's more like more neutral and kind of almost gray toned without being too gray. You get a couple pops of soft light pink in here. It is just so beautiful, you guys. I will insert some swatches for you guys so you can have a look at it closer. I don't know quite how to describe this. It's just a very well curated palette. This shimmer at the bottom, it looks a little bit darker in the pan than it actually is. There it is right there. It is one of the prettiest shimmers that you will ever pop on your lid. Just trust me, it is absolutely stunning. The combination of the shades in here between kind of gray taupes and light pinks just create the most beautiful, feminine, flattering eye looks maybe I've ever seen. This thing totally shocked me. I wasn't sure I was gonna like this, but I'm so happy that I gave it a try. Now we're down to my top 5. This is where it gets particularly good. Starting with number 5, we're gonna go with the Sydney Grace Love's Journey palette. Now this palette, when I got this, I thought, oh, this is gonna be so pretty and there'll be lots of pinks in here. And then you open it up and there are no pinks in here. These are all basically very simple, neutral to cool toned neutrals. It kind of gives me Natasha Denona Glam Palette vibes, but you get a couple of like warmer tones in here as well. It is stunning. If you don't like to venture into color or anything too bold, but you like some metallics, like some really punchy metallics, you're gonna love this palette. It is absolutely glorious. You get the prettiest eye looks out of this that are very, very neutral and soft, but more variety than you would think looking at the shades in the pan. One of the best neutral palettes if you don't like anything overly warm. It definitely leans more on the cool tone side despite this little corner right here. I mean, it's really basically just these two shades that are more on the warm tone. Everything else is pretty cool without being too gray. It's just a very good flattering eyeshadow palette in the Sydney Grace formula that you guys know I love. Ranked at number 4, I'm gonna go with my Natasha Denona Yucca palette. This palette is so good. Now this is a color story that's not really, I mean, you could technically use any palette any time of year, but this is definitely like a fall tone vibe palette for me. It's just the type of color story that I'm more in the mood for in the fall because of the tones in here. But man, you guys, is this a fun palette. You know how much I love Natasha Denona's eyeshadow formula. Great variety in here, some very unique shades that I don't think I've ever seen from anywhere else. It's very, very fun. I love all of the shades and formulas inside here. It's a very fun, creative palette if you're into these kind of fall oranges and greens and golds and silvers. Really good one. I wasn't sure I would like this palette when I picked it up, but I'm so glad I did. It really grew on me quickly. Ranked at number 3 is the palette that I'm wearing on my eyes today. You guys, this palette is so good. It is the Juvia's Place Coffee Shop palette. Now, definitely more of a warm tone vibe to this one. You get a handful of cooler tones in here, but you guys, these are so good. The formulas are rich, pigmented, blendable. The shimmer formulas are all stunning, and you get some different shimmer finishes in here, which kind of surprised me because I wasn't expecting that when I first looked at these. Today I'm wearing this shimmer all over the outer half of my lid, and it's kind of a little more on the sheer side. It has this really interesting kind of like cool tone, almost green sparkle to it that's absolutely stunning. I love this palette so much. I've always been a big fan of the Juvia's Place matte brown eyeshadow formula because they're so warm and rich and deep and just create this like intensely smoky, beautiful outer corner that just really dresses your eye look up. I just love a deep matte brown in the outer corner, and you get like 12 of them in here. So many good shades. Great variety in here. You get some copper, some more basic bronzes, some cooler tone browns. It's such a fantastic palette and probably one of Juvia's Place's best. I mean, their formula is almost always good, but these ones in particular are all exceptional. Ranked at number 2, I'm gonna go with the Lawless Dreamy Dozen palette. This palette I picked up in the holiday savings event sale a couple of months ago, and it has knocked my socks off, you guys. Now it is a little bit more on the basic side. You're not gonna get a lot of variety or color inside here. It's more for those of you into neutral, simple looks, but it is a perfectly curated palette as far as the shimmers you get, the mattes you get, the different undertones that you get. I did mention in the video where I first tried this out that it kind of reminds me of the Tartelette in Bloom palette, just the way that it's set up and the shimmers that you get and kind of the warmer, neutral, and then cooler tones, but it's not a dupe for that palette. They're definitely very different. I love the Lawless formula. The mattes blend instantly. I mean, you put them on, give them 3 little swirls, and you have a completed eye look in mere seconds. The shimmer formulas are all very nice. You get a basic champagne, something slightly deeper and a little bit more warm and golden, and then this taupe color right here. You just can get such great basic eye looks out of this palette. I've been very, very impressed with it. If you're looking for a good basic palette or want to gift a neutral eyeshadow palette, this is a fantastic neutral palette. And last but not least is a palette that I have a feeling is going to be on a lot of people's #1 palette of 2023 list, if there is such a thing. It is the Natasha Denona I Need a Nude palette. Holy smokes, you guys. It's so good. This reminds me of a slightly more pink version of the Glam palette, but I actually kind of think the feel of these are somewhat similar. They certainly aren't dupes for each other, but I kind of feel like if you have the Glam palette and maybe the Retro palette, which is more of her berry tone pink palette, you probably don't need this one because while you won't get any duplicated shades per se, you'll get a combination of similar shades. So maybe you don't need to go spend the near $70 on this palette, but if you have $70 to spend and you like these type of shades, I'm telling you guys, you will not be disappointed. And it's not even necessarily the shades in here, it's the finishes in here. And I haven't seen her do this in any of her other palettes. I know she did come out with a couple new finishes in here that she has not had in other palettes before. There are a couple finishes in here that are more sheer, they're kind of glitter toppers, but they give you this beautiful sparkle that you have to see in person. It's one of those things I don't think it comes across on camera, but if you see it in person, It is absolutely glorious. It just adds this very soft sparkle to your eyes that is just stunning. I can't say enough good things about it. I love Natasha Denona's variety of formulas, particularly in her shimmers. Now, the only complaint, if there is anything I could do to dissuade you from spending $70 on an eyeshadow palette that I love so much, there are no cream to powder formulas in here. You guys know I love that formula. That was the only thing I was wishing to see. I kind of wish that like one of these two shades would have been that formula, and this would have been the best palette in existence, but it's pretty darn close even without that formula included. Pretty simple in its color story, but the finishes are just glorious. And that is it, you guys. Those are all of my palettes from 2023 ranked. What did you guys think? Were you guys surprised by my ranking in any of these? This is always hard to do because you guys know how much I love eyeshadow palettes unless they truly suck, which is very rare. I think most palettes these days are generally pretty good. It's hard for me to rank some of these palettes down in the teens or the 20s because I actually still really like these. But at the end of the day, some are better than others for whatever those reasons are, and this maybe gives you a better look at what I particularly liked this last year or what really impressed me. Hope you guys enjoyed this one. I'd love to know what your #1 palette from 2023 is. Feel free to leave that down in the comments below. Thank you guys so much for watching. I hope you guys are all doing well. Let me give you one last reminder. Please subscribe before you leave, and I will see you guys in my next video. Bye. This is hard, guys. Some of these are tiny, so I can't. Tried to stack them, but some of them are like teeny tiny, and some of them are huge. It's like a bad game of Jenga. Formula with how pigmented they were. Seriously, someone's vacuuming upstairs. Thank you, though. Thank you for vacuuming. I actually really appreciate that. I wish your timing could have been